If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Jack Sullivan, and I've been a park ranger at Pine Valley National Park for almost 7 years now. I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me: bears, mountain lions, even the occasional lost hiker who swore they saw Bigfoot. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that freezing January morning. It was just another routine patrol on the Eagle Ridge Trail, the kind I'd done hundreds of times before. The sun was barely peeking through the pine trees, and my breath came out in white puffs in the crisp morning air. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in a pristine white blanket. The only sounds were my boots crunching in the snow and the occasional crack of a branch heavy with ice. That's when I saw it, something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Just off the trail, partially hidden behind a cluster of evergreens, stood what looked like a deer made entirely of ice. But this wasn't just any ice sculpture. This was different. The deer was frozen mid-leap, its muscles tense as if it had been running from something. What really got to me were its eyes. They were so detailed, so real, filled with what looked like pure terror. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, my hands shaking slightly. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. The ice was crystal clear, like perfectly frozen glass, and I could see every detail, every hair, every muscle, even the small scar on its flank that made me realize this was probably the same deer I'd seen drinking from Crystal Creek last week. This can't be natural, I whispered to myself, my words visible in the cold air. I reached out to touch it, and the ice felt strangely warm under my gloved hand. That's when I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. There were no tool marks, no signs that this had been carved. It was as if the deer had simply been frozen solid in an instant. As I walked further down the trail, my flashlight beam caught something else. My heart nearly stopped. There were more sculptures, a wolf in mid-howl, a family of rabbits huddled together, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a human figure. It was a hiker, backpack and all, frozen in a pose that looked like they were trying to run away. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but stopped. What would I even say? That I'd found impossible ice sculptures that looked too real to be man-made? That they seemed to be frozen in moments of pure fear? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I marked the location on my GPS and took dozens of photos. I needed proof, needed to document this before anyone else saw it. But as I stood there in the growing morning light, surrounded by these eerily lifelike figures, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong in my park. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. These sculptures weren't just art. They were a warning, and I should have heeded it while I still had the chance. That I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those frozen faces staring back at me. The next morning, I headed straight to the same spot before sunrise, clutching my thermos of hot coffee like a lifeline. But when I got there, something was different. The sculptures had moved. At first, I thought I was just remembering their positions wrong. Maybe I'm just tired, I mumbled to myself, rubbing my eyes. But no, I had the photos on my phone to prove it. The deer that had been facing east was now looking north. The wolf had somehow shifted closer to the trail. And the frozen hiker, it was gone completely. My hands started to sweat despite the cold. I pulled out my notebook and started writing everything down. Day 2. Sculptures moved approximately 20 feet from original positions. Temperature 25 degrees Fahrenheit. No footprints or drag marks in the snow. One sculpture missing over the next few days. I kept coming back. Each time, something was different. New sculptures appeared, a young woman with her hand reaching out, an old man with his dog, both wearing expressions that made my skin crawl. I started marking their positions on my park map with red dots. After a week, I could see a pattern forming. They were slowly moving toward the center of the park. One evening, while checking the sculptures just before sunset, I found something that made my blood run cold. Next to one of the frozen figures was a backpack, a real one, partially covered in frost. Inside, I found a driver's license belonging to Mike Chun, a hiker reported missing 3 weeks ago. This isn't happening. I whispered, my voice shaking. This can't be real. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, like wind through trees. But there wasn't any breeze. The temperature suddenly dropped so fast my teeth started chattering. I watched in horror as frost began creeping across the ground toward my boots, forming delicate patterns that looked almost like reaching hands. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The whispers grew louder, but I still couldn't make out what they were saying. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, fast. As I turned to run, my flashlight beam caught something that stopped me in my tracks. There, just behind a tree, was a new sculpture forming. Ice crystals were spreading up from the ground, taking shape like a time-lapse video of a growing plant. But this wasn't a plant. It was beginning to look like a person. I didn't stick around to see what it would become. I ran all the way back to my truck, not daring to look behind me. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was creating these sculptures had noticed me. And worse, I had a horrible feeling it wasn't done with me yet. I knew I had to figure out what was happening before anyone else disappeared. The next morning, I headed to the park's small library, where we keep all the old records. My hands trembled as I flipped through dusty files and faded newspapers. There has to be something here, I muttered, pulling out another box of old reports. That's when I found it, a yellowed newspaper article from 1952. 5 hikers vanish in Pine Valley during unusual cold snap. As I read more, my mouth went dry. Every winter since the park opened, people had gone missing, always during the coldest weeks, always without a trace. But there was more. In one ranger's log from 1973, I found this entry, found strange ice formations again. They look like people. Jenkins says I'm seeing things. But I know what I saw. They're moving at night. God help me. They're moving. The entry ended there. When I checked the employee records, I discovered that Ranger had disappeared 2 days after writing that note. I started connecting the dots on my office wall with string, like in those detective movies. Red string for missing people, blue for sculpture sightings, yellow for temperature drops. The pattern was clear as day. Whatever this thing was, it had been hunting in our park for at least 70 years. My phone buzzed, making me jump. It was a text from Sarah. Another ranger, Jack. Weird call from a hiker. Says they saw ice statues moving near Crystal Creek. Thought you should know. My heart sank. Crystal Creek was on the opposite side of the park from where I'd last seen the sculptures. They were spreading out. I grabbed my gear and headed out, even though everything in me screamed to stay away. The sun was setting earlier these days, and the shadows were already long when I reached Crystal Creek. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my radio started crackling with static. Then I heard it, that whisper again, but this time, I could almost make out words. Stay, join US, stay. The frost started forming around my boots again, but now I noticed something I'd missed before. The ice wasn't just spreading randomly. It was forming patterns that looked like handprints, hundreds of them, all reaching toward me. In the fading light, I saw movement among the trees. The The sculptures were there, more than I'd ever seen before, and they weren't just frozen in fear anymore. They were frozen mid-step, all facing my direction, like they were walking toward me. I backed away slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing off their glassy surfaces. That's when I realized something horrible. I recognized some of these faces. They were people from the missing persons reports I'd just been reading. These weren't just sculptures. They were a collection, and whatever was making them wanted to add me to it, that I should have left right then. I should have run as far as I could, but I needed to know what was happening. I couldn't let anyone else disappear, so I stayed, my camera ready, waiting in the growing darkness. The temperature kept dropping. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and the whispers grew louder. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, dozens of them, calling out names, pleading for help. I recognized one voice calling Mike. Mike, where are you? It had to be the missing hiker whose backpack I'd found. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died. The voices stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any whisper. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, something moved. It wasn't solid like the sculptures, but wasn't quite invisible either. It was like looking at air shimmering over hot pavement. Except this shimmer was ice cold and shaped like a person. As it moved, frost spread across everything it passed. My legs wouldn't move. I wanted to run, but I stood frozen, not by ice, but by fear. The shape came closer, and I felt the cold radiating from it. It was so cold it hurt to breathe. 7 years. A voice whispered, different from the others. 7 years you've walked these paths. You belong here now. Jack Sullivan. It knew my name. I finally found my voice. What are you? What do you want? The shape drifted closer. We are the forgotten, the lost ones, the ones who walked these trails and never left. We were alone, but now we have company. I started creeping up my boots, faster than ever before. I could feel the cold seeping through my layers of clothes. My fingers were going numb, and not from the normal winter chill. Join us. The voices started again, getting louder. Stay with us. Never be alone. Through my fogging glasses, I saw more shimmering shapes emerging from between the trees. Each one left trails of ice behind them. They were surrounding me, closing in with the last bit of warmth in my body. I reached for the emergency flare in my pocket. It was my only chance. If I could just... The shape rushed toward me. I felt the ice climbing up my legs. Everything was getting colder, darker. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. But I had to light that flare. Had to. My numb fingers finally found the flare. With all my strength, I struck it against my belt. A burst of bright red light exploded in the darkness. And the heat, oh, the blessed heat. The shimmering shape screamed, not in whispers anymore, but in high-pitched wails that made my ears hurt. They backed away from the flare's warmth, and I saw them clearly for the first time. They were people, or what was left of them. Every lost hiker, every missing person, their spirits trapped in the cold. The thing that caught them wasn't just freezing people. It was collecting souls, keeping them here forever. You don't understand, the main shape said, its voice like cracking ice. We keep them safe, safe from the world that forgot them, safe from time, safe from death. As the flare sputtered and sparked, I saw the truth in the ice sculptures around me. They weren't frozen in fear. They were frozen in the moment they realized they'd never leave. The deer, the wolf, even the people, all of them trapped by this thing that thought it was being kind. I know who you are, I said, my voice shaking. You're the winter itself, the cold that never leaves this place. You're lonely. The shape paused. Yes, it hissed. Seasons change. People leave. But here, in the ice, everything stays. Forever, the flare was dying. I could feel the cold creeping back. But now I understood. This thing didn't hate us. It just couldn't bear to be alone. All these years, it had been building its own frozen family, one victim at a time. But this isn't living, I said, watching my breath freeze in front of me. You're not protecting them. You're imprisoning them. The ice was up to my knees now. The flare flickered. Almost dead. I had maybe seconds left before, but understanding this thing had given me an idea. A crazy, desperate idea. My only chance to survive, and maybe help all the others too. With the last spark of the flare, I pulled out my phone. My frozen fingers could barely move. But I managed to press play on the video I downloaded earlier that day. The sound of summer. Children laughing at the park's lake. Birds singing in warm sunshine. Leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. The sounds of life. Of warmth. Of change. The shimmering shape stopped. The whispers went quiet. Listen, I said through chattering teeth. This is what you're taking from them. Life isn't about staying still. It's about changing. Moving, living. The main shape drifted closer. Curious now instead of threatening. The ice at my feet stopped spreading. We remember. One of the whispers said, summer, warmth. Another joined in. Home. More voices added. The ice sculptures around us started to crack. Small at first, then larger. I watched as the frozen faces began to change, the fear melting away, replaced by something else. Peace. The main shape started to fade. Perhaps we were wrong. It whispered, perhaps it's time to let go. The ice around my legs began to melt. One by one, the shimmering shapes disappeared. Like fog in morning sun, the sculptures cracked and melted too, leaving behind no trace. They were ever there. I collapsed in the snow, shivering but alive, when search and rescue found me the next morning. I was half frozen but breathing. They said I was lucky to survive the coldest night in park history. That was 2 weeks ago. The missing hikers' bodies were never found, but the disappearances stopped. Sometimes, on quiet winter nights, I still hear distant whispers in the wind, but they're different now, not threatening, just remembering. I still work at Pine Valley National Park. People ask me if I'm scared. After my close call with hypothermia, I just smile and tell them to respect the wilderness, to respect its power to change, to move, to live. But I keep a photo on my desk, the only one that came out clear that night. It shows a shimmering shape dissolving into the darkness, and behind it, dozens of smiling faces in the ice, finally at peace, because sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters that want to hurt us. Sometimes they're the lonely things that just want to keep us forever. My name is Jack Cooper, and I've been hunting in these woods for over 20 years. But what I'm about to tell you happened just last winter, and it still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I live in a small town called Pine Ridge, right at the edge of the Blackwood Forest. Most folks around here know me as the guy who can track anything that walks on four legs. I learned hunting from my father, and he learned it from his father before him. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's in my blood. That January night was different from any other hunting trip I'd ever taken. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and the moon was hiding behind thick clouds that looked like they were stuffed with snow. I remember checking my watch. It was just past 8 p.m. when I parked my old pickup truck at my usual spot near the forest entrance. Just a quick hunt. I told myself, adjusting my orange vest and checking my rifle one last time. Maybe catch that big buck I've been seeing on my trail camera. The moment I stepped into the woods, something fell off. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone suddenly stops talking? That's how the forest felt. Usually, you'd hear owls hooting or small animals scurrying around in the undergrowth. But that night, there was nothing, just the sound of my boots crunching in the snow and my breath, making little white clouds in the freezing air. I switched on my flashlight and started following my regular trail. That's when I saw them, tracks in the snow. But these weren't like any deer tracks I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of a normal deer print. And something about their shape just wasn't right. What in the world? I whispered, kneeling down to get a better look. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the last hour. My hunter's instinct told me to follow them. But something else, something deep in my gut, was screaming at me to turn around and go home. I should have listened to that feeling, but 20 years of hunting success had made me confident, maybe too confident. So I did what any curious hunter would do. I followed the tracks deeper into the woods, not knowing that this decision would change my life forever. The wind started picking up, making the pine branches creak and sway above my head. My flashlight beam bounced off the snow, creating strange shadows that seemed to dance around me. And those tracks, they kept leading me further away from my familiar hunting grounds, into parts of the forest I'd never seen before. I checked my compass, making sure I could find my way back, but even that was acting strange. The needle spinning lazily as if it couldn't make up its mind which way was north. That should have been my second warning sign. But I was too focused on following those mysterious tracks to pay it much attention. Little did I know, I wasn't tracking my prey that night. It was tracking me the deeper I went into the forest. The stranger things became. The tracks I was following started doing something impossible. They'd suddenly stop, then appear again 30 feet ahead, as if whatever made them could just vanish and reappear at will. This doesn't make any sense. I muttered to myself, my breath visible in the cold air. I've tracked every kind of animal in these woods, deer, elk, even the occasional bear, but nothing ever moved like this. The temperature seemed to drop with every step I took. My fingers were getting numb even inside my thick gloves, and the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I kept thinking about turning back, but something pushed me forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else was pulling me in, like a fish caught on a hook. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course, the time showed 9:30 p.m., and I realized I'd been walking for over an hour. The trees around me looked different now, older and larger than the ones near my usual hunting spots. Their branches stretched out like long, twisted fingers against the dark sky. That's when I heard it, a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. It was like a branch breaking, but too loud, too deliberate. Something big was moving in the darkness ahead of me. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against a thick pine tree, trying to control my breathing. Years of hunting had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling me I wasn't the hunter anymore. The moonlight broke through the clouds just enough for me to see movement about 50 yards ahead. At first glance, it looked like a deer, a massive one, but as I watched, I noticed things that were wrong. Its neck was too long, its legs too thin and jointed in places they shouldn't be, and when it turned its head, I saw its eyes. They glowed like two red coals in the darkness. My hands were shaking as I raised my rifle. Through the scope, I could see the creature more clearly, and I wished I couldn't. Its face wasn't quite right. It looked almost like someone had tried to make a deer mask, but got all the details wrong. Steady, I whispered to myself, trying to stop my hands from trembling, just like any other shot. But this wasn't like any other shot, and what happened next would prove just how wrong I was about everything. The creature stood perfectly still, staring right at my hiding spot. Did it know I was there? Could it sense me? I had the horrible feeling that it was just waiting for me to make my move in this deadly game of cat and mouse. I took a deep breath, steadied my aim, and placed my finger on the trigger. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting for what would happen next. Looking back now, I wish I'd just turned and run, but I didn't. Instead, I did what 20 years of hunting had trained me to do. I took the shot. The sound of my rifle shot echoed through the silent forest. But what happened next made my blood run cold. Instead of the usual thud of a bullet hitting its target, there was a scream, a horrible sound that was somewhere between a deer's call and a human shriek. The creature didn't fall. Instead, it straightened up, and I watched in horror as its body began to change. Its front legs lengthened into arms, its back straightened, and suddenly it wasn't a deer anymore. It was standing on two legs like a person, but much taller than any human I'd ever seen. No, 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 I whispered, fumbling to reload my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the bullet in the snow. The thing's head turned towards me, those red eyes now level with the tree branches, about 10 feet off the ground. Then it smiled. I'll never forget that smile, full of teeth that looked sharp as knives. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the snow. Behind me, I heard something moving fast. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footsteps told me it was chasing me. My lungs burned from the cold air as I ran. I jumped over fallen logs and ducked under branches, trying to remember which way led back to my truck. But in the darkness, everything looked the same. The moonlight cast crazy shadows that made it hard to tell what was a tree and what might be something else. I could hear it getting closer. The footsteps were heavy and fast, much faster than a person could run. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, showing glimpses of the forest ahead, but not enough to help me find my way. Then my foot caught on a hidden root, and I went down hard. My rifle flew from my hands, landing somewhere in the darkness. I rolled over, expecting to see that terrible figure standing over me. But there was nothing there. The forest was silent again, except for my heavy breathing and pounding heart. I lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, afraid to move, afraid to even blink. Finally, I managed to get to my feet. My hands were scraped from the fall, and my knee hurt, but fear made me forget about the pain. I found my flashlight in the snow and picked it up with trembling hands. That's when I saw it, standing between two ancient trees about 30 yards away. It wasn't moving, just watching me. In the flashlight beam, I could see its skin was like dark tree bark, and those red eyes seemed to burn right through me. Slowly, very slowly, I backed away. The creature didn't move, but its head turned to follow my movement. When I was about 50 yards away, I turned and started running again, this time not stopping until I saw the familiar outline of my truck through the trees. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove home faster than I ever had before. But even as I put distance between myself and the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I was right, it wasn't over at all. In fact, it was just the beginning that night. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red ones staring back at me. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound, the house creaking, the wind rattling the windows, even my own cat walking across the floor. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that maybe the cold and darkness had played tricks on my mind, but I knew better. The scratches on my hands and my bruised knee proved it wasn't just a bad dream. The next few days were torture. During the day, I felt like I was losing my mind. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, tall, dark shapes that vanished when I turned to look at them. At work, I'm a mechanic at the local garage. I couldn't focus. I dropped tools and made stupid mistakes. Something I never do. But the nights were worse. Much worse. It started with the dreams. In them, I was always back in those woods, running from something I couldn't see. But these didn't feel like normal dreams. They felt real, like memories playing out in my head. Then the scratching started. Every night around 3 a.m., I'd hear something, scratching at my bedroom window. At first, I told myself it was just tree branches in the wind, but my bedroom is on the second floor, and there aren't any trees close enough to reach the window. One night, I finally got the courage to look. I pulled back the curtain just a little bit, and there, in the darkness, I saw them, two red eyes, floating in the darkness, staring right at me. I dropped the curtain and ran downstairs, my heart feeling like it would burst out of my chest. My cat, Shadow, started acting strange too. She would sit and stare at empty corners of the room, her fur standing on end. Sometimes she would hiss at nothing and run to hide under my bed. Cats can see things we can't. My grandmother used to say, and now I was starting to believe it. I stopped going into my backyard after dark. It borders the forest. And sometimes, when I looked out there at night, I could see a tall, dark figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It never moved, just stood there watching my house. If I blinked or looked away, it would be gone when I looked back. I knew I needed help, but who would believe me? I couldn't go to the police. What would I tell them? That I shot at a deer that turned into a monster? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. But then I remembered something. Old Tom, who runs the bait shop in town, had lived here his whole life. He was always telling stories about the forest that most people laughed off as tall tales. Maybe, just maybe, he would know something about what was happening to me. I didn't want to go back to those woods ever again, but I knew I had to do something. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to leave me alone, and I had a feeling that if I didn't figure out what it wanted soon, things were only going to get worse. Much worse. The bell above the door of Tom's bait shop jingled as I walked in. The small store smelled like coffee and fishing gear. Old Tom was behind the counter, organizing fishing lures. His wrinkled face looked up as I approached. "Jack Cooper," he said, studying my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe worse than a ghost." I replied, my voice shaking a little. I told him everything about the tracks, the creature, and how it was now haunting me. While I talked, Tom's face grew more serious with each word. When I finished, he walked to the door and flipped the open sign to closed. Then he made us both coffee and sat down heavily in his old wooden chair. I was wondering when it would show up again. He said quietly, "It's been 15 years since the last time." My hands tightened around the coffee cup. "You mean this has happened before?" Tom nodded slowly. "My grandfather called it the Guardian. The local tribe that lived here hundreds of years ago had another name for it. The spirit of winter's heart. They said it protects the forest during the coldest days of winter. But why is it after me?" I asked. "I've been hunting these woods for years." "That's just it, son." Tom leaned forward. "The old stories say it only appears in the deepest cold of winter, when the forest is at its most vulnerable. It punishes those who disturb the woods during these sacred times." I remembered how unusually cold it had been that night. What happened to the others who saw it? Tom's eyes got distant. Some moved away. Others, he paused. They said the spirit drove them mad with fear until they went to the forest to make peace. Make peace? How? The stories say you have to return to where you first saw it. Bring an offering, something personal, something that matters to you. Leave it there and ask for forgiveness. But it has to be genuine. Jack, you can't trick a spirit that's older than the forest itself. I thought about my father's hunting knife, the one he gave me before he died. It was my most precious possession. And if I don't, Tom shook his head. Those visions you're having, the feeling of being watched, they'll get worse. The spirit doesn't give up. Jack, it has all the time in the world. I left Tom's shop with a heavy heart, but a clear purpose. I knew what I had to do, even though every part of me was screaming not to go back into those woods. That night, I stood in my kitchen, holding my father's knife, watching the sun set through my window. The forest seemed to grow darker than the sky around it, like a black hole waiting to swallow me up. I knew I had to go back, one last time, but as I prepared for what I had to do, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was out there right now, watching me, waiting for me to return to its domain. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what it wanted all along the next evening. I drove back to the forest. My hands were sweating despite the cold as I gripped the steering wheel. My father's knife lay wrapped in a clean cloth on the passenger seat. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Before getting out of my truck, I took a deep breath. You can do this, I whispered to myself. Just go in, leave the offering, and get out. The forest looked different now, more alive somehow. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, and the wind whispered through the branches like it was trying to tell me something. I followed my old footprints from that night, still visible in the frozen snow. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I walked. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every rustle in the branches above made my heart race. But I kept going, clutching my father's knife close to my chest. After about 20 minutes, I found the spot. The two ancient trees where I'd last seen the creature stood like silent guardians. The air felt colder here, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. With trembling hands, I unwrapped the knife. Its leather handle was worn smooth from years of use, and the blade still shone in my flashlight beam. My father's initials were carved into the handle. RC, I'm sorry, I said out loud, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. I'm sorry for disturbing your forest, for not respecting its peace. This knife, it means everything to me. It's yours now. I placed the knife carefully at the base of one of the trees. As I straightened up, the wind suddenly stopped. The forest became completely silent. Then I felt it, that familiar sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned around. There it stood, just like before, but different somehow. Its red eyes weren't as fierce now, and its presence didn't feel as threatening. We looked at each other for what felt like forever. Then, very slowly, it nodded its head. A wave of peace washed over me, and I knew, somehow I just knew, that it was over. The creature turned and walked into the darkness between the trees, each step silent in the snow, until it disappeared completely. I walked back to my truck in a daze. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. The scratching at my window never came back. The shadows stopped following me. Even my cat, Shadow, went back to her normal self. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, I still think about what happened. I never went hunting in those woods again. Now when winter comes, I stay away from the forest, but sometimes, when I'm driving past those ancient trees, I swear I can see two red eyes watching from the darkness, guarding their domain. I learned something important from all this. The forest isn't just a place for us to take what we want. It's alive in ways we don't understand. And sometimes, if we're not careful, it reminds us of that fact in ways we'll never forget. The knife? I never saw it again, but every now and then, on particularly cold nights, I dream about it lying there at the base of that old tree, keeping its eternal watch alongside the guardian of winter's heart. Some say the creature is still out there, watching and waiting, and maybe it is, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the night my hunt turned into something else entirely, something that changed the way I see the forest forever. My name is Alex Bennett, and I still get chills thinking about what happened last January in the Blackwood Mountains. I've always loved hiking, but after what my friends and I experienced in those snowy woods, I'm not sure I'll ever look at winter trails the same way again. It started when my three closest friends, Mike, Sarah, and Jenny, decided we needed a weekend adventure to break up the boring winter months. We'd been cooped up for weeks, and cabin fever was hitting us hard. Mike found this remote trail online, deep in the Blackwood Mountains, that looked perfect for a day hike. Come on, guys, it'll be fun, Mike said, showing us pictures of snow-covered peaks and pristine forests on his phone. We've done plenty of winter hikes before. The day before our trip, while grabbing supplies at the local outdoor store, the old shopkeeper's face went pale when we mentioned where we were headed. Folks don't go up there in January, he said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he rang up our items. Not since the settlers disappeared back in 1879. I laughed it off. Every small town has its spooky stories. I told my friends as we left the store, but something about the way the old man looked at us stuck with me. Like he wasn't just telling some tourist tale. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his warning. So I did some quick research on my phone. There were old newspaper articles about missing hikers in the area, all in January, spread across different years. Something felt off, but I pushed the feeling away. We were experienced hikers. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The morning of our hike was bright but bitterly cold. Our breath came out in thick white clouds as we pulled into the empty trailhead parking lot. The snow crunched under our boots as we adjusted our backpacks and checked our gear one last time. Guys, is it weird that no one else is here? Jenny asked, hugging herself against the cold. The silence around us was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our own breathing. It's perfect, Sarah said, already starting up the trail. We'll have the whole mountain to ourselves. If only we'd known then what that emptiness meant. If only we'd listened to the warnings. But we were young, confident, and completely unprepared for what waited for us up in those mountains. As we started climbing the trail, the trees grew thicker, their branches heavy with snow. The sun disappeared behind clouds, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. None of us knew it then, but we were walking straight into a nightmare that had been waiting for us for over a century. I remember checking my phone's GPS one last time before the signal disappeared completely. We were truly alone now, cut off from the world, as the forest closed in around us like a frozen trap. Little did we know, something was already watching us from the shadows between the trees, waiting to show us why some trails should stay untraveled in January. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when the weather took a turn for the worse. The light snow that had been falling turned into thick, swirling flakes that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Maybe we should turn back, Jenny said, her voice shaking slightly. This doesn't feel right. I was about to agree when Mike pointed to something through the trees. Look, there's a figure up ahead. Maybe it's another hiker who can tell us if we're still on the right path. Squinting through the snow, I saw what he meant. Someone was standing perfectly still about 50 feet away, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in history books about pioneers. "Hello," Sarah called out, waving. "Are you okay?" The figure slowly turned toward us, and my stomach dropped where there should have been solid body. I could see right through to the trees behind. The ghost, because that's what it had to be, was a woman in a torn dress, her hair moving in a wind we couldn't feel. "I can't be seeing this," I whispered, rubbing my eyes. But when I looked again, she was still there. The ghost raised a pale, transparent arm and pointed to our right, toward a dark opening in the cliffside. Her mouth opened, and though no sound came out, frost formed in the air as she moved her lips. Mike pulled out his phone to take a picture, but it wouldn't turn on. "Guys, my phone's dead. It was at 80% just 10 minutes ago." The ghost drifted closer, and the air around us grew so cold it hurt to breathe. Now we could see her face clearly. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, but her eyes were full of sadness and fear. "Listen," she mouthed, and this time we heard a whisper that seemed to come from inside our own heads. "The cave holds death. We found it in 1879. We thought it was shelter, but it was a trap. Don't make our mistake. January awakens it. Turn back." Jenny grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Alex, I want to leave now." But Mike was already walking toward the cave entrance the ghost had pointed to. "Come on. Guys, this has to be some kind of projection or trick. Maybe there's someone playing a joke on hikers." The ghost's face changed from sadness to panic. She moved between Mike and the cave, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. The temperature dropped even more, and our breath came out in thick white clouds. "She's trying to warn us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This isn't a joke." I looked at the ghost again, and for a moment, our eyes met. In that second, I felt everything she felt: the terror, the regret, the desperate need to save us from whatever waited in that cave. But Mike was already disappearing into the darkness of the cave entrance, and Sarah was following him. "We can't leave them," I said to Jenny, though every instinct was screaming at me to run back down the trail. The ghost watched us with those sorrowful eyes as we walked past her toward the cave. As I passed through the spot where she stood, it felt like walking through a sheet of ice. The last thing I heard before entering the cave was a soft, echoing sob that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The moment we stepped into the cave, something felt wrong, really wrong, while it was freezing outside. The cave was strangely warm, like someone had left a heater running, but that wasn't possible. We were miles from anywhere with electricity. "Look at the walls," Sarah whispered, shining her flashlight beam around us. My blood ran cold. The cave walls were covered in weird symbols, carved deep into the rock. They looked ancient, like something from a civilization that existed long before anyone lived in these mountains. Some symbols looked like twisted faces, others like stars that didn't match any constellation I knew. "These weren't made by settlers," I said, running my fingers over one of the marks. The stone felt warm to the touch, almost like it was alive. Mike was already deeper in the cave, his excitement making him careless. "Guys, it gets bigger up ahead. There's some kind of chamber." Jenny stayed close to me, her hand gripping my jacket. "Alex, I don't like this. Those symbols, they seem to be glowing slightly." She was right. The deeper we went into the cave, the more the symbols seemed to give off a faint, greenish light. It was subtle at first, but soon we didn't even need our flashlights to see. The narrow passage opened into a large room, and that's when things got even stranger. The air here was so warm it felt like summer, and there was a soft humming sound, like a distant machine. "Do you hear that?" I asked. But my voice sounded different in here, like I was talking underwater. Mike walked to the center of the chamber, where a circular pattern was carved into the floor. "This is incredible. We might be the first people to see this in decades." Sarah pulled out her journal to sketch the symbols, but her pencil kept breaking every time she tried to draw them. "That's weird," she muttered. "It's like they don't want to be copied." Then we heard it, voices whispering from deeper in the cave. They sounded like people talking just around the corner, but we couldn't make out the words. "Hello," Mike called out. "Is someone there?" The whispers got louder, but now they seemed to be coming from different directions. Some sounded like children laughing, others like old people talking, and some didn't sound human at all. "We need to leave," I said firmly, remembering the ghost's warning. "Right now." But as I turned to look at the passage we'd come through, my heart stopped. The symbols on the walls were definitely glowing now, pulsing like heartbeats, and the way back seemed different, longer and darker than before. Jenny squeezed my hand harder. "Alex, where's Mike?" I spun around. Mike had been right there in the center of the room just seconds ago, but now, where he had been standing, there was only empty space and that strange circular pattern on the floor. And the whispers, they were getting louder. "Mike!" Sarah screamed, her voice bouncing off the cave walls. "Mike, where are you?" The whispers grew louder, and now I could almost understand what they were saying. They sounded like promises of warmth, of amazing discoveries, of answers to questions we'd never even thought to ask. "We have to find him," Sarah said, starting to walk toward a dark tunnel that led deeper into the cave. Her eyes looked strange, almost glassy, like she was in a trance. "Sarah, wait!" I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "Don't you hear them?" she whispered. "They're calling us. They want to show us something beautiful." Her voice didn't sound like her own anymore. Jenny pressed against my side, shaking. "The symbols are moving," she whimpered. She was right. The glowing marks on the walls were shifting, like snakes made of light, forming new patterns. The humming sound got deeper, making my teeth vibrate. "Sarah, please," I begged. "Remember what the ghost said. This is a trap." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She took another step toward the tunnel, then another. "Mike's in there," she said dreamily. "He's waiting for us. They're all waiting." Before I could stop her, she walked into the darkness. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and then silence. Sarah was gone. "No!" Jenny screamed, starting forward, but I held her back. "We can't follow them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever's in there, it's what took all those other people, the settlers, the missing hikers. They all fell for the same trap." The air got warmer, and the whispers started again. This time they sounded like my mom's voice, then my best friend from childhood, then people I hadn't thought about in years. They were all calling my name, telling me to come deeper into the cave. Jenny's grip on my arm suddenly loosened. "Alex," she said softly, "I can hear my little brother. He died 2 years ago, but he's here. He's asking me to come play with him." "Jenny, no, it's not real." But I could see her eyes going glassy like Sarah's had. "Just for a minute," she mumbled. "I just want to see him for a minute." I tried to hold on to her, but it was like trying to grab smoke. She slipped through my fingers and walked into a different tunnel, one I hadn't even noticed before. The whispers swelled, and then she was gone too. I was alone in the chamber. The cymbals pulsed faster now, and the voices were getting louder, more insistent. They promised me everything I'd ever wanted: success, love, answers to life's biggest mysteries. All I had to do was walk a little deeper into the cave. My feet started moving on their own. Part of my brain was screaming at me to run. But the whispers were so beautiful, so convincing. Then I felt something ice cold touch my shoulder, and a familiar voice cut through the whispers like a knife through fog. Run. That icy touch snapped me out of the trance. The ghost from outside was floating beside me, her transparent face filled with panic. Behind her, the whispers turned into angry screams that made my head hurt. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The passage back seemed endless, twisting in ways it hadn't before. The symbols on the walls flashed angry red now, and cold winds started howling through the cave. Something was chasing me. I could feel it getting closer, but I was too scared to look back. "Don't stop," the ghost's voice echoed in my head. "Don't look back." I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were on fire. But I kept going. The cave entrance seemed to get further away with each step, like in a nightmare where you can't escape no matter how fast you run. Finally, I saw daylight ahead. With one last burst of energy, I dove through the cave opening, rolling into the snow outside. The angry screams from the cave suddenly cut off, like someone had closed the door. The ghost appeared next to me, looking tired. If ghosts could feel tired. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't save your friends, just like I couldn't save mine." Who are you?" I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "Emily Matthews. I led a group of settlers here in 1879. We found the cave during a snowstorm. Thought it would be shelter." Her form flickered like a candle. "We didn't know what lived inside, what had always lived inside, waiting for people like us." "What happened to my friends?" I asked. Even though I was afraid to hear the answer, there were the others now. All the people who've been taken over the years. The cave, it feeds on people's desires, their wishes. It shows them what they want most. Then she faded slightly, like a radio losing signal. "But why January?" I asked. "The barrier between our world and theirs is thinnest in January." She said, "That's when they can reach out, call to people. That's why I stay, trying to warn others away." I looked back at the cave entrance. For a second, I thought I saw Mike, Sarah, and Jenny standing there, waving at me to come back. But they didn't look quite right. Their eyes were too dark, their smiles too wide. "Go," Emily said softly. "Tell others. Warn them. It's all we can do." I stumbled down the mountain trail, my legs shaking. When I finally reached my car, my phone turned on again. It showed 17 missed calls from my mom. I'd been in that cave for almost 12 hours, though it felt like minutes. The police searched for my friends for weeks. They found nothing. Of course, the cave looked normal when they checked it. No symbols, no warmth, no whispers. They said my friends probably got lost in the snow. But I know better. Every January, I go back to that trailhead and post new warning signs. Most people tear them down, thinking they're jokes. Sometimes I see Emily watching from between the trees, and we share a look of sadness. And on quiet nights, when the snow is falling, I sometimes think I hear whispers calling my name, trying to lure me back to that cave. But I never answer. I just hope that somewhere out there, Someone will hear our story and stay away from the Blackwood Mountains in January, because some places hold ancient secrets that should stay buried, and some desires are better left unfulfilled. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've lived in the small town of Pine Haven all my 32 years. Never in my life did I think I'd have to tell a story like this. But someone needs to record what happened during that strange January night when our whole town lost its memory. I woke up that morning feeling odd, not sick exactly, but like something wasn't quite right. My head felt fuzzy, like when you sleep too long but still feel tired. The digital clock on my bedside table showed 7:43 a.m., and through my window, I could see fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in white. That's when I realized I couldn't remember going to bed last night. I sat up, trying to think back to the previous evening. Tuesday. It was definitely Tuesday. I remember having coffee at the diner where I work, serving old Mr. Henderson his usual meatloaf, and then nothing, just a blank space where memories should be. Maybe I'm coming down with something, I muttered to myself, but my cat Max's behavior told me something else was wrong. He sat in the corner of my bedroom, his yellow eyes wide and alert. Fur standing on end. Max never acted like this. I walked to the bathroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and that's when my phone started buzzing like crazy. Text messages flooded in, all from different neighbors and friends. Did you black out last night? Can't remember anything after 8 p.m. Something weird is going on. My hand started shaking as I scrolled through the messages. This wasn't just me. The whole town seemed affected. I quickly threw on my warm clothes and boots, then headed for my front door. That's when I saw them long, deep scratches in the wood, like something with massive claws had tried to get in, my heart pounding. I opened the door carefully. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped onto my porch. The fresh snow should have been pristine, but instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Perfect circles, about 15 feet across, were pressed into the snow all along my street. They looked like giant fingerprints left by some massive, invisible hand. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, was already outside in her purple winter coat, staring at her own door. More scratches. She turned to me, her face pale. "Sarah," she called out, her voice trembling. "What happened last night?" I walked over to her, careful to avoid stepping in the strange circles in the snow. "I don't know, Mrs. R. I can't remember anything either. The birds," she whispered, pointing up. I looked around and realized she was right. There wasn't a single bird in sight. No crows on the power lines. No sparrows at her bird feeder. Even the usual morning sounds of our small town seemed muffled, like something was still lingering in the air, keeping everything quiet. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Tom, my best friend who worked at the local police station. "Sarah, you need to come down to the station right now." His message read, "Something's happened at Old Man Crawford's house. And bring your camera. You're the only one in town who knows how to use that fancy photography equipment properly." I looked back at my house, where Max sat in the window, still refusing to come outside. Whatever had happened last night, whatever had left those marks, I had a feeling we were about to uncover something our small town had been hiding for a very long time. And somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. The drive to the police station was eerie. Usually, Pine Haven is full of life in the morning. Kids waiting for school buses, people walking their dogs, the breakfast crowd at Mary's Diner. But today, the streets were almost empty. Those few people I did see were standing in their yards or on porches, staring at those strange circles in the snow. Tom was waiting for me outside the station. His police uniform wrinkled like he'd slept in it. His face looked worried, which was unusual for him. Tom usually jokes about everything. "Thanks for coming," he said, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "You're not going to believe what we found at Crawford's place." As we drove to Old Man Crawford's house in Tom's police car, he filled me in. Crawford was the town's hermit, a weird old man who lived alone at the edge of town. Nobody had seen him in days, which wasn't unusual, but this morning his front door was wide open. "The weird thing is," Tom said, gripping the steering wheel tightly, "all our security cameras went dead last night. Every single one in town. Just static from 8 p.m. until sunrise. We pulled up to Crawford's house, an old 2-story building that needed a fresh coat of paint. The same claw marks I'd seen on my door were here too, but deeper. Like, whatever made them had really wanted to get inside. Watch your step," Tom warned as we walked through the snow. Those circular impressions were here too, but bigger, maybe 20 feet across. Inside, the house was freezing cold. Papers were scattered everywhere, and there were more scratch marks on the walls. But what caught my eye was Crawford's desk. Everything on it was perfectly arranged, like someone had carefully sorted through it. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to an old leather journal sitting in the middle of the desk. "We haven't touched it yet. Wanted you to photograph everything first." I took out my camera and started taking pictures of the room, the marks, and the desk. As I worked, Tom picked up the journal and started reading. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you need to hear this." He read from the journal. January 15th, 1963. "They made the pact today. The shadow with white eyes came to them, offering protection for the town. They agreed to its terms. God help us all." My hands were shaking as I took the last few photos. "Tom, what happened to Crawford?" Before he could answer, we heard something upstairs, like footsteps, but too light to be human. Tom reached for his gun, and I held my camera tight. "Maybe we should come back with more people," I whispered. That's when we heard it, a sound like nails scratching on wood, coming from upstairs. Then silence. Tom's radio crackled to life, making us both jump. "All units, please respond. We've got multiple reports of strange marks appearing on buildings downtown, similar to the ones from this morning." We looked at each other, then at the window. The sun was still high in the sky, but somehow the light seemed different now, colder, less safe. "We need to show this journal to the town council," Tom said, carefully putting it in his jacket. "Something tells me they might know more about this than they're letting on." As we left Crawford's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. In the trees across the street, I saw something move, just a shadow, but for a second, I could have sworn I saw two white, glowing points of light, like eyes, staring right at us. We had to hurry. Somehow, I knew we didn't have much time left to figure out what was happening to our town back at the police station. Tom and I sat in the break room with the old journal. My hands were shaking as I made us both coffee, not from the cold, but from fear of what we might find in those yellowed pages. "We should start from the beginning," I said, sitting down next to Tom. The journal's leather cover was worn and cracked, showing its age. Tom opened it carefully. The first entry was dated January 1963, written in neat handwriting. "My name is Edward Crawford. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know the truth about Pine Haven, about the deal they made, about the shadow that comes every January. I felt a chill run down my spine as Tom read on. It started with the mine collapse. 30 men trapped underground. The town was dying. That's when Mayor Wilson and the council met it. The thing with white eyes. It offered to save our town, to protect us from disasters. All it wanted was a tribute. One soul. Every January. This can't be real. I whispered, but deep down, I knew it was. It explained too much. The missing people over the years. Always in January. Always ruled as accidents or people moving away. Tom flipped through more pages. Each January had an entry. Each one describing a different person who vanished. Then we found something that made us both freeze. A list of names, 30 names, with dates next to them. The last name was crossed out, James Henderson, January 2024. Wait, I said. My coffee forgotten. James Henderson? Mr. Henderson's son who supposedly moved to Chicago last year. Tom nodded slowly. He never made it to Chicago. Did he? Suddenly, the lights in the station flickered. Outside, the winter sun was setting early. As it always does in January, my phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Sarah, come quick. The circles in the snow, they're changing. We rushed to the window. The circular marks we'd seen this morning were starting to glow faintly, giving off a pale blue light. People were coming out of their houses, staring at the strange sight. That's when we found the last entry in Crawford's journal. Dated just yesterday. I've failed for 60 years. I've tried to find a way to break the pact. The shadow knows. It's coming for me tonight. Whoever finds this. The tribute list is almost full. When it reaches 33 souls, the shadow will take the whole town. Only one more name left to add. You have until sunset tomorrow. Find the original pact. It's hidden in the old mine shaft. There's always a way out of a deal. You just have to find the right words. The station's lights flickered again, then went out completely. In the darkness, Tom's flashlight beam showed more scratches appearing on the window, forming right before our eyes. Sarah, Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Look, across the street, standing between two glowing circles in the snow, was a tall, dark figure. It seemed to be made of shadows, but its eyes were bright white, and they were looking right at us. We need to get to that mine, I said, grabbing Crawford's journal. Now, as we rushed to Tom's car, I couldn't help but think about what Crawford wrote. One more name, one more soul, and less than 24 hours to save our town. The shadow figure watched us drive away, and in my rearview mirror, I saw it smile, a terrible, white slash in its dark face. The old mine entrance looked scarier than I remembered from my childhood. Tom parked the police car, and our headlights shone on the rusty keep out sign. The sun was getting lower, painting the snow orange and red. My flashlight's not working, Tom said, shaking it. None of our phones would turn on either, but we couldn't wait. We had to go in. Luckily, I kept an old battery-powered lantern in my camera bag. Its weak light barely lit up the mine's entrance as we stepped inside. The air smelled like wet dirt and old wood. Crawford's journal said the pact would be near the collapse site. I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Every sound echoed in the tunnel. Our footsteps, our breathing, even the soft drip of water from the ceiling. Tom pointed to some old signs on the wall. This way to Section C. That's where the collapse happened in '63. As we walked deeper into the mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Shadows seemed to move just outside our lantern light. The scratching sounds we'd heard at Crawford's house started again, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. Look, Tom suddenly stopped. On the wall, there were marks that looked like the ones on our doors. But these were older, much older. They led to a small tunnel we might have missed otherwise. The tunnel was tight. We had to crawl through on our hands and knees. The scratching sounds got louder, closer. Finally, we reached a small room carved into the rock, and there, in the middle of the floor, was a metal box. "It's locked," Tom said, pulling at it, but when I touched the lock, it just fell apart, like it was waiting for us to find it. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellow with age. The writing was faded but clear enough to read. "We, the Council of Pine Haven, do hereby agree to the terms set forth by the entity, in exchange for protection and prosperity. We offer one soul each January, freely given or taken by force. Upon the collection of 33 souls, the entity shall claim its final reward, the entire town and all within it. Signed in blood by Mayor Wilson and the Town Council. January 15th, 1963, 32. I whispered, Crawford was number 32. It only needs one more person to take the whole town. Suddenly, our lantern started to flicker. The scratching sound stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of breathing, heavy and unnatural, coming from the tunnel behind us. That's when we saw them, two white eyes glowing in the darkness. The shadow had followed us. The pact. It spoke, its voice like wind through dead trees. You found it, but it's too late. The sun is setting. Time to collect. Tom stepped in front of me, but I knew what I had to do. Crawford's last words in the journal came back to me. There's always a way out of a deal. You just have to find the right words. The paper in my hand suddenly felt warm. The entity moved closer, its white eyes fixed on us. But something about the pact's wording caught my eye, something that might save us all. If we could just figure it out in time. That MY hands trembled as I held the old paper closer to our flickering lantern. The shadow creature moved closer, its white eyes growing brighter. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the mine walls. The pact says the souls must be freely given or taken by force. But Crawford wasn't either. The shadow stopped. The air grew colder. "What do you mean?" Human, its voice made my teeth hurt. My mind raced as I worked it out. Crawford didn't give himself freely. And you didn't take him by force. He disappeared. The pact is broken. You broke your own rules. The entity made a sound like breaking glass. Tom grabbed my arm as the tunnel began to shake. "You dare question the pact?" The shadow grew larger, almost filling the tunnel. "Yes." I held up the paper. "And look, the council members signed in blood. But the entity didn't sign at all. A deal needs both sides to sign. That's how contracts work." The white eyes flickered. For the first time, the shadow seemed uncertain. "These are mere words." It hissed, but I could hear doubt in its voice. "Words have power." I said, remembering what Crawford wrote, "That's why you needed this pact in the first place. Without a proper contract, you have no right to take anyone." The shadow shrieked, a sound that made us cover our ears. The lantern exploded in sparks. In the darkness, I felt Tom pull me toward the tunnel entrance. "Run," he yelled. We crawled through the tunnel as fast as we could. Behind us, the shadow's screams shook the whole mine. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The scratching sounds turned into a roar. We finally reached the main tunnel and ran toward the entrance. The setting sun painted the snow blood red as we burst out of the mine. The whole town was there, standing around those glowing circles in the snow. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Henderson, everyone. They remembered everything now. The shadow erupted from the mine entrance, but it was different, smaller, weaker. The white eyes weren't as bright. "You cannot break this pact," it screamed, but its voice was fading. We already did. I held up the paper. A deal works both ways. You failed to protect Crawford. You broke the agreement first. The glowing circles began to fade. One by one, they disappeared from the snow. The shadow creature writhed and twisted, getting smaller and smaller. This isn't over, it whispered, its white eyes dimming. Winter comes every year. I'll be waiting. With a sound like a dying wind, the shadow vanished. The scratches on buildings disappeared. Even the old paper in my hands crumbled to dust. Tom looked at me in the growing darkness. Is it really over? I looked around at my town, at the faces of people I'd known all my life. We all knew the shadow's last words were true. It would try to come back. But now we knew how to fight it. No, I said. But next time we'll be ready. No more secrets. No more deals in the dark. As we walked back to town, I thought about Crawford. We never found him, but his journal saved us all. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even if nobody believes you. That night, for the first time since I could remember, everyone in Pine Haven slept soundly. Even the pets came out of hiding. And when January comes again next year, we'll be watching. Some stories don't end. They just turn into warnings. Because in Pine Haven, we now know that shadows are real. Deals have power. And sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we invite in ourselves. My name is Sarah Collins, and I still wake up screaming some nights, remembering what happened at Crystal Lake last winter. Most people don't believe my story, but I need to share it, if only to warn others about what lies beneath those frozen waters. It was early January when my husband Mike suggested we try ice fishing. Come on, honey, he said, showing me pictures of Crystal Lake on his phone. It'll be an adventure. Just the two of us. I wasn't too excited about spending a weekend in the cold, but Mike had that boyish excitement in his eyes that always melted my heart. Crystal Lake was about 3 hours from our home in Minnesota, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the state where the pine trees grow so thick they block out the sun. We arrived early Saturday morning, the winter sun barely peeking over the horizon. The lake was completely frozen, its surface like a giant mirror reflecting the gray sky above. It's so quiet, I whispered to Mike as we stepped onto the ice. Our boots made crunching sounds that seemed too loud in the stillness. There wasn't another soul in sight. No other cars in the small parking area. No ice fishing huts. Nothing but endless white stretching before us. Mike found what he called the perfect spot about 100 yards from shore. He started setting up our little portable ice shelter while I helped unpack our gear. The drill made an awful screeching noise as Mike cut through the ice. And that's when I first felt something was wrong. You know that feeling when you're alone in a dark room, and you're sure someone's watching you? That's how it felt out there on the ice. Every now and then, I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but smooth ice and snow. Mike, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Does the ice look strange to you? He looked up from baiting his hook, frowning slightly. Strange how? I don't know. Like, there are shadows moving under it. He laughed, but not unkindly. That's probably just fish. Honey, that's why we're here. Remember, I tried to believe him. I really did. But as the morning wore on, those shadows seemed to grow larger, more defined. They weren't moving like fish. They were too big, too organized. And sometimes, when I pressed my face close to the ice and squinted, I could swear I saw straight lines down there, like the edges of buildings. Mike, I said again. Around noon, I really think you should look at this, he sighed, probably thinking I was just trying to get out of fishing. But he came over anyway. We both knelt on the ice. Looking down through the hole he'd drilled, what we saw made us forget about the cold, about fishing, about everything except the impossible sight below us. Through the crystal clear ice, we could make out the unmistakable shape of a rooftop. And it wasn't alone. That was the moment our peaceful fishing trip turned into a nightmare. If only we'd packed up and left right then. If only we hadn't let our curiosity get the better of us. But we did. And what happened next, well, that's where the real horror began. Mike started clearing away the snow with his gloved hands, and I joined him. Soon we had uncovered a patch of ice about 10 feet wide. What we saw below made my heart stop. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Mike, are those houses?" Through the thick ice, we could see an entire street of small wooden buildings. They looked old-fashioned, like something from an old Western movie. But that wasn't the scariest part. Through one of the windows, I could see a dining table with plates still set for dinner, as if the people who lived there had just gotten up and walked away. "This is impossible," Mike muttered. But he couldn't take his eyes off the sight either. The lake charts don't show anything about a town here. We kept clearing more snow, revealing more of the underwater village. There was a general store with its sign still hanging, though the words were too faded to read. A small church with a crooked steeple. Even a schoolhouse with tiny desks visible through the windows. "Look," I pointed to something that made my skin crawl. On the street, frozen in time, was a child's toy wagon, tipped over on its side as if dropped in a hurry. Mike took out his phone to take pictures, but it wouldn't turn on. "Battery's dead," he said, frowning. "But I just charged it this morning." The winter sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky, but we couldn't stop exploring. We found more buildings, about 20 in total. Each one told its own sad story. Half-eaten meals on tables, open books on bedside tables, rocking chairs stopped mid-rock. "Sarah," Mike said suddenly, his voice shaking, "look at this." Near what looked like the town square, we found a large clock mounted on a post. Its hands were frozen at 3:47, and around its base was a plaque. Mike brushed away the ice to read it. "Welcome to New Hope, founded 1892. I've never heard of this town," I said. But something else was bothering me. The buildings, the furniture, the wagon. Everything looked perfectly preserved, as if the lake had swallowed the town whole in a single moment. That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this empty wilderness. From somewhere beneath the ice came the faint, clear ringing of a church bell. Mike grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, unable to speak, because as the sound faded away, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. In one of the house windows below, a shadow moved, and then another, and another. The sun was setting now, painting the ice in shades of red and purple. We should have left right then. We should have run back to our car and never looked back. But we stayed, frozen in place, as the shadows beneath the ice began to move with purpose. And that's when the voices started, AT first. The voices were just whispers, so quiet I thought I was imagining them. But then they got clearer, sounding like they were coming from underwater. They were calling out names, having conversations, like a busy day in a small town. Except this town was at the bottom of a frozen lake. "We need to go," I said, pulling on Mike's sleeve, but he wouldn't move. "Sarah, listen," he said, kneeling down and pressing his ear to the ice. "They're trying to tell us something." I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave Mike, so I knelt beside him. And that's when I heard a child's voice, clear as day. "Come play with us." My hands started shaking through the ice. I could now see lights flickering in the windows of the submerged houses. Not electric lights. They looked like old oil lamps, casting a soft, golden glow that shouldn't have been possible underwater. "Mike, please," I begged. "Something's not right here." But Mike was already walking toward another clearing in the ice. Under his feet, I could see into what looked like the town's post office. Letters were scattered across the floor, and behind the counter, an old-fashioned calendar hung on the wall. The date read, February 15th, 1907, Sarah. "Come look at this." Mike called out, "I think I know what happened here." I walked over carefully, the ice creaking under my feet. Mike was pointing at a newspaper frozen in time behind the post office window. The headline was still readable. "Dam construction begins despite town protests. They flooded the valley to make this lake." Mike said softly, "They must have forced everyone to leave." But something went wrong. That's when we heard the cracking sound, not the normal sounds ice makes. This was different. It sounded like something was breaking free from below. The voices got louder. They weren't whispers anymore. They were calls, shouts, screams, and they were coming from everywhere around us, through the ice. I saw something that made me scream. The shadows in the houses weren't just moving anymore. They were taking shape, human shapes, and they were looking up at us. An old woman's face pressed against a window, her eyes wide open. A man in old-fashioned clothes stood in the middle of the street, pointing up at us. Children crowded around the schoolhouse windows, their faces pale and ghostly. They never left. I whispered, "The town wasn't evacuated. They're all still here." The sun had almost set now, and in the growing darkness, the underwater lights grew brighter. The voices became a chorus, all saying the same thing: "Stay with us. Join us." Mike's flashlight flickered and died. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. And then, right beneath our feet, a hand pressed against the underside of the ice. The ice began to crack. The crack in the ice spread like a spider's web around us. Mike grabbed my hand and yelled, "Run!" But where could we run? In the fading light, I could barely see where the ice ended and the shore began. The ghostly lights from below were now our only real source of light, making everything look weird and scary. We started running toward where we thought we'd left our car, but the ice kept cracking behind us. And the voices, oh, those voices, they were getting louder and more angry. "You can't leave. Stay with us. We've been so lonely." I made the mistake of looking down as we ran, through the ice. I could see them, dozens of people in old-fashioned clothes, walking through their underwater town, looking up at us. Some were reaching up with pale hands, trying to break through the ice. "Mike, don't look down!" I screamed, but it was too late. He had stopped to stare at something below. There was a little girl in a white dress, holding a teddy bear. She was smiling up at him and reaching out her hand. "She's just scared," Mike said in a strange, quiet voice. "Maybe we should help Dash, Mike." Oh! The ice under his feet started to glow with a blue light. I could hear it cracking, but Mike wouldn't move. He just kept staring down at the little girl. "They didn't mean to leave us here," Mike said, but his voice sounded different now, like he was talking in his sleep. The water came so fast. "We just want someone to stay with us." "Wait," did he say we? I grabbed his arm and pulled hard, but he wouldn't budge. The ice was cracking faster now, and the blue light was getting brighter. All around us, more faces were appearing under the ice. Old people, young people, children, all reaching up with ghostly hands. "Mike, please," I was crying now. That's not really a little girl. We need to go. He turned to look at me, and my heart nearly stopped. His eyes were different. They had the same blue glow as a light coming from under the ice. But Sarah, he said with a strange smile, they're all so lonely down here. That's when the ice finally broke. The crack started small, but then split wide open like a hungry mouth. The last thing I saw was Mike, still smiling that weird smile, as dozens of pale hands reached up through the dark water and pulled him down. I never even heard him scream. I don't remember how I ran away. Everything was a blur of fear and cold and darkness. Behind me, I could hear the ice breaking and those awful voices calling. Try to make me come back. But I kept running. My lungs burned from the freezing air. Every step could have been my last. The ice was cracking everywhere now. The ghostly blue light followed me, glowing under my feet as I ran. In that light, I could see them swimming below, chasing me through their underwater town. She's leaving us. Don't let her go. Come back. Come back. I tripped and fell hard on the ice. When I looked down, I saw Mike's face right below me, but it wasn't really Mike anymore. His skin was pale as milk, and his eyes glowed that terrible blue. He smiled up at me, that same strange smile he had before they took him. Stay with me, Sarah, he said, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. The water's not so cold once you get used to it. I screamed and scrambled back to my feet. The shore had to be close. It had to be. Then I saw it, the outline of trees against the night sky. Just a little further. The ice was breaking faster now. I could hear it cracking behind me like gunshots. Water was splashing up through the holes. And with it came cold. Wet hands trying to grab my ankles. Something caught my boot. I kicked free without looking back. The voices were getting desperate now, screaming and crying. I felt the ice sink under my feet and knew I had one last chance. I jumped. My body slammed into solid ground just as the ice broke behind me. I rolled through the snow and kept crawling until I reached the trees. Only then did I look back. The lake was dark except for that blue glow moving under the ice. I could see them all down there, the people of New Hope, swimming through their sunken town. And among them was Mike, holding hands with the little girl in the white dress. They all looked up at me one last time before slowly fading away into the dark water. I sat there in the snow until sunrise, shaking and crying. When daylight finally came, I called for help on the emergency phone in the parking lot. But I knew what would happen next. The police came with their boats and diving teams. They searched the lake for 3 days straight. But they never found Mike. They didn't find the town either. No buildings. No streets. Nothing but dark water and fish. Ma'am, the police chief said gently, are you sure about what you saw? The cold and dark can play tricks on your mind. I showed them where we'd parked, where we'd been fishing, but the ice had frozen back over, smooth as glass, hiding all its secrets. Our fishing gear was gone too, like it had never been there. They found old records though, ones that proved I wasn't completely crazy. There really had been a town called New Hope, and it really had been flooded to make the lake back in 1907. But according to the records, everyone had left before the flooding. Everyone except, well, that's what keeps me awake at night. Sometimes I drive back to Crystal Lake, but I never get out of my car. I just sit in the parking lot and watch the water. On quiet evenings, when the sun is setting, I swear I can hear faint music coming from below the surface, like an old piano playing in the church. And sometimes, when the light hits the water just right, I see movement down there. Last week, I got a letter. The envelope was wet, and the paper inside was damp. but the handwriting was Mike's. All it said was, "I miss you. Sarah, the water's not so cold anymore. Won't you join us?" I burned the letter, but I can't burn the memories. I can't forget the faces under the ice, or the sound of those voices, or the way Mike smiled at the end. The police filed it as a drowning accident. They said the ice must have been too thin, that Mike fell through and the current carried him away. Maybe that's better than the truth, but I know what really happened at Crystal Lake, and now. So do you just promise me one thing? If you're ever driving up north in winter and you see a sign for Crystal Lake, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look at the ice. And whatever you do, don't listen to the voices that call from beneath the surface, because they're still there, in their underwater town, still waiting, still lonely, and they're always looking for new neighbors.